Good. Right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Caroline and Caroline, for organising this and inviting me to speak. Right, let's get cracking. Begin by considering trees. If we look at the House of Lords committee in 2009, that looked at EU woodland, one of the headline findings from that was that the UK is one of the least wooded areas of Europe, just 11.7% woodland, compared with around 37% for EU 27 members. In fact, Forest Commission has updated those figures. 2023, the figure was 13%. Of the approximate 2.8 million hectares of woodland in the UK, around 1 million is estimated to be native. So that means almost twice the area that we have of native woodland is actually plantation woodland. And my point really is that this story of the UK being one of the least wooded areas of Europe has been a major driver for establishing plantation woodland of this sort. This is the flow country. So it's an area of Blancmange landscape, which is in effect upland. It's outside the enclosed agricultural land. And the point I want to make is that this drive to increase our tree cover has fallen disproportionately on the uplands, which in many ways is not logical. If we look at a relief map of Britain, this is courtesy of the Germans from 1940, we can see that a very large proportion of the UK is actually lowland ground. And this, of course, is where our temperate forests would have been a dominant feature of the landscape. But let's be clear, the loss of our woodland cover, resulting in us being one of the least wooded nations in Europe, is down largely to farming. This is a 1940 map of types of farming, and everything except the slightly sickly yellow. The slightly sickly yellow is upland. Everything else, apart from the red of the metropolitan areas, is a different farming type. So this is what has removed the vast majority of our native temperate woodland. If we look at agricultural land use in the UK, we can see that the dark blue sector, rough grazing, takes up, it's about a third of agricultural land use. So, in other words, upland areas offering opportunities for woodland expansion represent a much smaller proportion of the landscape than do lowland areas. Yes, they are our important agricultural land, but this is a discussion and debate that needs to be had. Because if we look at trees and the uplands, what we find is that actually, the woodland contribution in our upland landscape has always been pretty slim, pretty minimal. Tallis and Switzer surveyed 400 kilometres square of the South Pennine uplands, and essentially what they identified was that, yes, there were tree remains within the shallower marginal areas of peat, and also generally below a threshold of 520 meters altitude. When they looked at the contribution of pollen over the period from the last ice age through to the present day, what they were able to identify in terms of the proportion of pollen from different woody groups was that initially we had a periglacial landscape of scrub, juniper, and so on. Then the boreal forest species, birch, willow, pine, started to become much more dominant across the landscape. But through to modern times, it's really the temperate forest species that were our predominant woodland type. The contribution made by boreal species had, by modern times, by modern I mean before the real bulk of agricultural development, the boreal species had become really a much smaller proportion of the tree pollen. So if we look at the sort of numbers that Tallis and Spitzer came up with, and we consider that as you move north, every 100 kilometers you move north, this represents a descent of 100 meters in altitudinal conditions. So the open landscape zonations observed by Tallis and Spitzer in the Peat district, once you get to Moor House in the North Pennines, which are at 600 meters, we are probably well above the threshold of altitudinal requirements for even the scrub zone, never mind some of the boreal woodland species. So places like Moor House probably always been largely free of woodland. And in fact, if we look at if we look at the stream sides within Moor House, we can see that there's pretty much no evidence of woody tissue. There are a few very minor, mainly birch, and this is along a streamside where if you're going to have trees, you would expect to find evidence of trees. And even in the really shallow peats here on the road cutting between Alston and Penrith, we still don't see any trees, and we don't see any evidence of woodland cover. So if we take a broader view, a global view, and consider the sorts of landscapes where blanket mire tends to occur, and we have British Columbia, we have Newfoundland, Britain and Ireland and parts of Norway, and then Kamchatka, plus in the southern hemisphere we have Tierra del Fuego. First of all, in British Columbia, we can see that the blanket mire landscape is like a sort of filigree net curtain where the open bog is surrounded by the green of woodland, basically scrubby woodland. The woodland only really becomes taller trees along the evident streamlines. Elsewhere, we can see that it's following the lines of water movement, channeled water movement. Similarly, we go to Kamchatka, and the way that the forest follows streamlines is even more evident. Here in Newfoundland, we see the same pattern again. So if we go to other parts of the world, which are characterized by blanket mire, we find that there is an intimate arrangement of the open blanket mire landscape together with woodland and scrub. But the woodland and scrub are essentially associated with the steeper slopes and with areas of water movement. Here in Tierra del Fuego, we have peatland systems, and we can see that really quite scrubby woodland communities are simply following streamlines. Within this same valley, there are areas of taller woodland, but these are associated largely with spring lines, major areas of mineral flushing. In other words, it would be reasonable to assume that our original blanket mire landscape had this same network, intimate mixture of open bog and woodland. And if we look here, we're on the path up to Moor House, and within this landscape, we can see, because of the Juncus communities, we can see areas of flushing, and without grazing, almost certainly these areas would support some scrub. Just a bit lower down along the trackway, we can indeed see trees which are sheltering along the streamlines, in part because it's harder for the sheep to get at them, in part because the microclimate is more benign, but also because they are benefiting from the oxygenated water and the increased minerals that the stream supplies. But if we now turn our attention to the peat itself, what we see is something very different from what we observe in places such as Kamchatka and the Queen Charlotte Islands in Canada. We have peat capping the broad summits, and then we have this abrupt break between the peat and the mineral soil. We have peat cliff faces representing the edge of our peatland landscape. And that is in effect an impossible thing to develop naturally. You cannot have a vertical peat face developing naturally. So what this tells us is there's something missing. Something has vanished from this transition zone. There should have been transition from peat to the mineral in a more gradual fashion. And in fact, John Tallis, in his '89 paper, Fire and Flood at Home Moss, talks of, in effect, icebergs of peat carving away from these peat faces. This situation is not sustainable. So if we look at, for example, Tierra del Fuego, and we start walking up the hills, already actually we are on a peat surface, but then we come on the steeper slopes to these densely wooded regions. Once we walk into this dense wood, we can see that it really is extremely dense. It was quite a struggle making our way through this. But if you look at the forest floor, it's completely moss dominated, and we're already on peat which is more than a metre deep. This peat formation, which is partly moss and partly timber products, it's timber debris. It's very similar to the sort of peat that forms in peat swamp forests in tropical regions. But as we come out onto the plateau summit, the forest gives way to scrub. And as we look back over the landscape, we can see various open areas all of which are surrounded by this ring of forest. And on the summit, this is where we have the wettest landscapes, perched right on the hilltop. We have large open pools, very similar to the sort of thing you see in the flow country of Scotland. As the slope increases, we can see that we're starting to get the scrubby elements of this landscape appearing. Everything is stable. There's no sign of instability here. Unlike this very stark transition from peat to non-peat. Now, when engineers are dealing with unstable slopes, they use soil nails. That's what these various prongs going into the slope are. They stabilize the slope using these soil nails. So my thought was, having walked through these forested areas in Tierra del Fuego, and seen the way that the trees appeared to hold the peat in place, just like soil nails, I would do an experiment where I created a hill, filled it, made it waterproof, grew a woodland on one slope, and then covered it with blancmange. Glaciologists use blancmange to model the effects of glacial movement, so it didn't seem too bizarre to use blancmange in this case. Having laid the blancmange on there, very quickly I began to see the carving of the blancmange in exactly the same way that John Tallis described for home moss. But what I didn't see was similar movement through this, as it were, natural woodland. All the while, the blancmange slabs were carving away from the non-wooded slope. The wooded slope remained stable. And in fact, looking closely at it, it really reminded me of the sort of conditions that I'd observed in Tierra del Fuego. And in fact, Kate Hanley has been already mirroring this sort of approach by adding saplings into damaged peatland areas, and she's already observing sphagnum growing up round the boles of these planted trees. This is very much the act of a soil nail. So we're now seeing really a much more stable sphagnum-dominated carpet. I wanted to use this slide that Patricia MacDonald sent to me. She was pointing out that unfortunately the felled forest on the slopes here in Great Glen has now been replaced with a new conifer plantation. This is not the sort of approach that I would recommend at all. I very much favour natural recolonisation by removal of grazing, but certainly not the use of plantation forestry, A, to increase our woodland cover generally, and B, as a means of stabilising our blanket mire margins. I would argue that what we should be doing is having the debate about how much deciduous woodland we should be growing in our agricultural lowlands and encouraging the natural regeneration of woodland within our blanket mire marginal areas. If we do that, then we get the benefit of the carbon storage of the hardwood trees within our lowland landscapes. In the upland landscapes, we benefit from the carbon capture, not of the trees, but of the stabilizing of the peat and encouraging of peat development over areas which are currently devoid of peat. And we only need about 30 to 40 centimetres of peat to be equivalent in carbon storage per hectare, equivalent to a hectare of tropical rainforest, because there are no gaps in peat. It's a continuous carbon storage mechanism. So just moderate success with encouraging woodland scrub development on our peatland margins could have a massive benefit for our carbon storage.
Richard,
actually,
5-minute warning from me.
That's great. What I'm actually talking about is our Atlantic rainforests. There's a big push now. People are getting very excited about our Atlantic rainforests. Well, this Atlantic rainforest has a peat floor. It's dominated by sphagnum species. There is undoubtedly a substantial carbon store within this forest. The amount of carbon in the trees, probably not so much. But in terms of the peatland, the forest floor, we are talking about major carbon storage. So what we have here is a coming together of two really important communities, our Atlantic rainforest and our Atlantic blanket mire landscape. And the thing about these landscapes, these Atlantic rainforests with a peatland floor, is they represent a form of true bog woodland, which has a very distinctive British and Irish character. Bog woodland on the continent tends to be low-lying. It's more fen bog community. But bog woodland is recognised as an important type under the Habitats Directive. So we would have a different type of bog woodland with its own characteristic biodiversity, stability for our blanket mire margins, major impact on slowing release of waters from high rainfall events, and thus have a significant role in reducing flood risk. All those benefits. I'll leave you with that thought.
Fabulous, thank you. Really fascinating to see the matrix of the habitats in the different peaty, woody landscapes across the world, and then that consideration of what's unique to us and the benefits for nature and carbon in that. Really interesting. Thanks, Richard. And see, some questions have started to come in, but we will go to Lee next. I'll just stop the recording for this one so that each presentation is recorded separately.